All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Jen Torgerson. I am a sales counselor here at Riverwoods, Manchester. And welcome to the Financial Risks and Rewards of Retirement Communities. We appreciate you joining us today. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. You are muted, but we welcome your questions, and you can type your questions into the Q&A box starting now. We have over 300 people registered for this program. Some will be watching later. We are recording this, but we will have a lot of questions to get to toward the end of the presentation, so feel free to start entering those now. And we appreciate your suggestions on how to improve this program as well as future ideas for programs. So the Riverwoods family of communities includes Riverwoods Exeter, which opened in 1994. Riverwoods Exeter with the Woods that's opened in 1994, the Ridge in 2004, and then the Boulders that opened in 2010. Riverwoods Manchester started in 2016. It was actually an affiliation with a community that had been here since 1991. And Riverwoods in Durham opened in 2019. SPE or STE stands for someplace else or something else, which is a potential future campus or program. So really quickly, what is a CCRC, Continuing Care Retirement Community? The contracts are regulated by the state of operation, in our case, New Hampshire. Financial performance is reported to the state annually. And essentially, you are prepaying and insuring for your future care needs or nursing needs. A portion of the entrance fee and monthly fee are tax deductible for this reason. It's also a lifestyle choice. You enter when you're living independently, allow us to take on the workload, and you get to do the fun stuff, activities, programs, education, concerts, lectures, classes, volunteer opportunities. It allows you to stay engaged and more engaged as you age and stay in control of your life. So I want to welcome our presenters from today, Keith Robertson from Ziegler Capital, which is the nation's leading financial underwriter of financing for nonprofit senior living providers. Kevin Goyette, CFO of the Riverwoods Group. Kevin's responsible for the financial oversight of Riverwoods Group and plays a significant role in future business development. And welcome Bill Stafford, Riverwoods Exeter resident since 2016, who's in medical equipment sales and marketing and CFO of the Milwaukee Philharmonic Orchestra. So welcome, gentlemen. And Keith, I'm actually going to pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jen. It's really great to be here. It's a real honor. Before I dive into the slides I'm going to cover, just to give you a high-level overview of who Ziegler is. We're a boutique investment banking firm that primarily focuses on mission-driven organizations. And one of the top sectors that we focus a majority of our energy on is the not-for-profit senior living sector. I've been working in the not-for-profit senior living sector for, at this point, about 26 years. It's wonderful clients, wonderful organizations, all mission-driven. And we'll get into a little bit more later on about the differences between the for-profit and not-for-profit sector. But as a firm, we spend a lot of time as the leader doing a lot of research and education of what's really happening in the industry. And that's a lot of what you're going to see today is the research that my colleagues, the woman who runs our research practice is Lisa McCracken. She's phenomenal, great insight into the industry. So all the information that we're going to share today is from Lisa and her practice. So I think it's my job today to kind of give you a 30,000-foot perspective of what's happening in the senior living and care industry. And with a primary focus in the not-for-profit sector. And those of us in the industry, I would say we spend a majority of our time talking about the challenges that we face, which are primarily, I'd say, workforce challenges. And we're going to go into more detail onto a lot of these things. But inflation, increased construction cost, competition from within and without the sector, some changes happening to the how we deliver care, and just overall general pressures. But at the same time, we also see a lot of opportunity. And we'll get into really where that opportunity lies, and those who are suited to pursue those opportunities. But even though there's a lot of challenges for the industry right now, I'm sure many of you heard some of the challenges coming, going into COVID and during COVID, but the industry itself really thrived. Other than some, I would say, some bad media during the pandemic, it really is thriving now, and there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of opportunity in front of us. Next slide, Kim. So, and I think there's a few fly-ins. Maybe hit the forward button one more time. There we go. Great. So, the biggest opportunity that we all see, and frankly, many other participants see and recognize, is the demand for the senior care product. And we generally focus on people who are 75 and older. And I can tell you, over the next 8 years, between now and 2030, at the same time when all baby boomers are 65 and older, the number of folks who are 75 and older, there will be an additional 10 million people. And then if you go out another 10 years to 2040, there'll be another 20 million people. So the number of people that the senior living industry, senior living and care industry, is going to need to be prepared to serve is going to nearly double over the next 20 years. So it's a fairly staggering number, and it's organizations like Riverwoods that are who see this data and understand that there's a huge need for their services, and are doing everything they can to position themselves to really care for that population. Next slide, Kim. A couple more fly-ins. There's our friendly elephant, but the real elephant in the room for I would say the entire sector, and it's not just the senior living and care sector, it really is a lot of other industries. There's a few more fly-ins, Kim, sorry. It is really workforce. So workforce is where I would say a lot of the conversations that we have at all levels, whether it's at the higher level with other consultants or on the ground with our clients, everybody is dealing with workforce challenges. Prior to the pandemic, I would say there was a workforce challenge. Now that we are out of the pandemic or moving out of the pandemic, most folks would call it a workforce crisis. It's hard to find people. If you find people, they're oftentimes burned out. There's a lot of turnover. They're looking for different types of staffing models. They want to be flexible with their work. But I can tell you from talking to a lot of players in the sector, the not-for-profit sector tends to do better than the for-profit side of the industry in terms of staffing and primarily turnover, primarily because of the mission-driven aspect of the not-for-profit providers. Generally a higher quality of life. If you assume everything else is equal pay, hours, to have a higher quality of life, the not-for-profit providers do provide that not only to their residents, but also to their staff. But it's something that we've been aware of for a long time. When I started in this industry, the number of caregivers per senior, which was really a math calculation of folks who were under a certain age compared to those who were over a certain age, that number went from 7 to 1. And right now it's around 3 to 1. So just the number of people who are able to care for seniors has declined significantly. And we see those numbers only accelerating. So it is a very challenging time. And it's something that we are all aware of and are trying to find solutions to. Next slide, Kim. Thank you. So we talk a lot about the health of the sector, and one of the primary drivers of health in the sector is occupancy. The phrase that Kevin and I use all the time is occupancy is the fuel that drives the senior living engine. And without occupancy, you don't have the revenue to pay for all the expenses that, and many of those expenses are fixed. So going into the pandemic in March of 2020, Occupancies on both the not-for-profit and for-profit side of the sector were strong. They were all north of, or at least on the not-for-profit side, north of 90%, right around 93%, and did experience a fairly significant decline in the year or two during the pandemic, and dropped from about 93% to about 86%. We have seen a slight uptick in occupancies, but it's not a significant increase, with the average occupancy right now just north of 87%. This is a national perspective. In the Northeast, I would say occupancies are still quite strong, higher than the 87% that we see on a national basis. Comparing the not-for-profit decline to the for-profit decline, on the for-profit side of the industry, of the CCRC industry specifically, the for-profits actually averaged around 87% for a long time. And then when COVID hit, they had a much steeper decline in occupancy, to roughly 78%. They've seen a slightly more rapid increase, but many of the CCRCs provided on the for-profit side of the industry are, I would say, a rental. And the occupancy on rental communities tends to be a bit more volatile than in comparison to the entrance fee product that many of the not-for-profit organizations utilize. Next slide, Kim. So when I talk to organizations about what's happening in the industry, I oftentimes will spend a lot of energy on this one slide. So this is it's the growth slide, comparing the not-for-profit sector to the for-profit sector. During the financial recession, the financial down years of 2008, 9, 10, and then going into 11, virtually all the organizations that serve seniors really put the brakes on, didn't do a lot of strategic planning, and really didn't incur much growth. Some did, but many didn't. In 2011, right around 2011, the for-profit sector saw the opportunity that was in front of them and aggressively pursued growth strategies, especially when compared to the not-for-profit sector. The not-for-profit sector has averaged around 1 or 2%, average annual growth, where at the same time, the for-profit sector since 2012 has had a 21 to 22 times factor or growth factor over the not-for-profit sector. And for those of us who work in the not-for-profit side of the senior care industry, we certainly feel that the not-for-profit organizations do it better. They generally provide a higher quality of care, better staffing ratios, all the money that a not-for-profit, and Kevin might go into this later, but all the money that a not-for-profit organization provides stays with the organization. It doesn't go to fund the owners, nice big houses or mortgage payments. It stays with the organization. So there's just generally a higher quality of care, but over time, really since maybe over the past decade, the for-profit sector has been aggressively growing while the not-for-profit sector hasn't. So a lot of the markets that the not-for-profit organizations were leaders in, they're no longer, because the for-profit sector has taken such a large market share away from those good, solid not-for-profit organizations. There are some really strong not-for-profit organizations who have maintained a growth trajectory, including the Riverwoods organization. I'm sure Kevin will get into that later. But this slide tells me a lot. It means the not-for-profit organizations need to really step up and maintain their level of leadership within the sector. So one of the tools that Ziegler's research group utilizes is our CFO hotline. It's a survey of all the CFOs in the industry, and we do them on an ongoing basis. And one of the topics that we do focus on a lot is growth. So pre-pandemic, we had done a survey right before the pandemic hit in March of 2020. And growth plans were fairly typical from what we've seen from the not-for-profit sector, which is a large predominance of unit expansion, some new communities, some growth through partnerships and or mergers and acquisition opportunity, and then a small percentage of home and community-based services. And when we started to poll folks during the pandemic and now coming out of it, A lot of the organizations had shifted away from their growth through physical plant expansions, more towards expanding their home and community-based service offerings. And that really has continued from right after the pandemic started to today. So that's where most of the growth that we're seeing is coming from. So pre-financial crisis, the not-for-profit sector generally grew through building new communities. And we've seen that number decline significantly, coming out of the pandemic, or I'm sorry, coming out of the financial crisis. And it's just starting to accelerate more than it had over the prior 10-year period. But what the not-for-profit sector is building in terms of new campuses has changed. A lot of what was built in pre-2000 in the 2010s was new campuses with a full complement of care, independent living, assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing. A large majority of the communities that are now being built by the not-for-profit sector don't include skilled nursing. So there's a lot of organizations that are moving away from the skilled nursing model. It's hard to staff. Generally, it's not a moneymaker for organizations. So that's a major shift that we're seeing across the sector. And we think it's going to have a significant impact on the overall care that's being delivered to folks. All right, next slide. So one of the macro trends that Ziegler tracks very closely is the number of, the phrase that we use is sponsorship transition. Because when you're a not-for-profit, when two organizations come together, there generally isn't a lot of money that's exchanged, but you sort of change ownership or sponsorship. So that activity has been very robust since, I would say, the early 2010s, but has really picked up since 2015. And over the course of time, about 725 not-for-profit senior living organizations has changed hands. About 46% of that 725 communities have left the not-for-profit sector and have been acquired by the for-profit sector. So even though the for-profit sector is growing, doing more in terms of construction, they're also accumulating some of the properties that had been not-for-profit. So this is a macro trend. There are some organizations that are very progressive on the not-for-profit side, looking at sponsorship transition opportunities. And again, I'll look at Kevin and the Riverwoods organization. And that's how Riverwoods Manchester is now a part of the Riverwoods family through this sponsorship transition process. All right, so one of the headwinds that we had talked about just a little while ago was inflation. We are experiencing a lot of inflation within the sector, and generally most not-for-profit organizations, their only source of revenue is from resident monthly service fees. So one of the questions that we ask through our CFO hotline is, what type of monthly service fee increases are you using each year? And going back even before 2015, I would say the average monthly service fee increase was somewhere around 3%. And that's really across the board. Some organizations were higher, some were lower, but on average, we were right in that 3% band. And then when real expense pressure started to hit the industry, the average increase in 2022 last year was 4%, with a median increase of 4.5. This year, we're seeing about a point higher than that. And this is projected, but it's based on the survey feedback that we've gotten. So we are seeing some real monthly service fee pressure really across the board. Those of us who are on the finance side we don't like seeing the monthly service fee increases, but it is important for organizations to keep up with expenses. Given if your expenses go up by 5 or 6% and you're only increasing monthly service fees by 2 or 3, that organization is going to end up losing money, but then potentially more over time. So it is, from a business practice, very important to keep up with the increase in expenses by increasing your revenue. But what we do see, especially on the not-for-profit side of the industry, is they're not being, I would say, overly aggressive on those monthly service fee increases, with the average being around 4 to 5%. But at the same time, inflation is just is north of 8%. I think it came in at 8.2% yesterday, with core inflation at 6.6%. Keeping monthly service fee increases in that 5% range tells me that the not-for-profit sector is being very careful when it comes to raising monthly service fees on their residents, recognizing that many of them are on fixed incomes. So another macro trend that we're seeing across the industry and frankly across the world is the acceleration of the use of technology. This was accelerating pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, the acceptance and the acceleration of the use of technology grew by multiple factors. I know many, at least I hear from many seniors, including my mother, that she had her first telehealth appointment. So I think there's just a much greater acceptance of technology, and there are some wonderful technologies out there. In Ziegler as a firm, we track many of them, but all these categories that we have here on the slide: telehealth, engagement solutions, workforce solutions, brain fitness, monitoring systems, care coordination, smart home technologies. All of these are being used by organizations like Riverwoods, but also there's a greater acceptance among seniors as well as family members of seniors. And what it's done is it's allowed us to be more efficient, which is great during times of inflation, but also to stay in touch and to provide our services better. This is absolutely critically important to get your arms and embrace technology, especially as the staffing challenges have become so acute. We're able to still provide many of the services that we used to be able to provide through with people now through technology. So it's wonderful. I would keep your eyes open for new technologies that are coming our way. But one of the things that we do see in the adoption of technology is the larger organizations, the stronger organizations are able to do a better job with technology, like Riverwoods, a larger system in the Northeast. Riverwoods has the ability to look at these technologies, to understand them, to pay for them, but then also to implement them and keep up with other technologies. A lot of single site organizations don't have that capacity. And that's one of the drivers that we're seeing towards sponsorship transition and or partnerships, because the smaller organizations just don't have the capacity. All right, so one of the things that Kevin and I do on the finance side is we track how everybody else is doing in the industry. And one of the tools that we utilize to see how the industry itself is doing is ratings. So speaking of life plan communities or continuing care retirement communities like Riverwoods and all the Riverwoods communities, there's about 1,930 CCRCs. But there's only 164 organizations that have credit ratings. So credit ratings have become a real sign of strength. The primary rating agency is Fitch. As you can see, they're the purple bars. And Fitch really understands the sector. They have analysts who really understand credit strength, credit weaknesses, and Riverwoods is rated by Fitch in the A category, and being in the A category is among the most premier organizations in the country. Next slide. So looking at tracking performance, we do utilize rating agencies, but there really aren't a lot of other tools that are out there for me and for you to really track how the industry itself is doing. But some of the tools that we do utilize are the rating agency reports. There is a form of accreditation of life plan communities. Although the number of communities that are accredited is less than 10%, it's called CARF accreditation. But CARF has gone away from I would say, truly understanding a lot of the CCRCs out there. So just the number itself is very small. There are some industry publications that can be utilized. I know Riverwoods on their website has some of these documents. But then the other thing that I use primarily is a website called EMA. So it's emma.msrb.org. And it's so the MSRB is the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. So anybody who has public debt and they're required to post disclosure. And through this website, anybody has access to this disclosure information that they provide. So it's become a really wonderful tool because most or many not-for-profit organizations have debt. I would say most do. And the primary form of debt is tax-exempt debt. If that debt happens to be public, they have to post their information here on Emma. But we are working really hard on making sure there are other forms of disclosure. Many states require organizations to post their disclosure statements. So there are tools out there for you to review or look at organizations that you're thinking about moving into, and then also do a side-by-side comparison. And with that, that's the high-level overview of the sector. So I'll turn it over to Kevin to talk about Riverwoods.
All right, thanks, Keith. That's Keith's 30,000-foot view will now come down to about 10,000-foot view for us here. You know, the first thing for you all to be thinking about as you're going through this process is what are your options? And they can run the gamut from staying at home and anticipating you will never need services, all the way up to not doing anything and you have a life-changing event where you have to move to an assisted living community or worse off, a nursing community without having planned. And then that is really a need-based decision as opposed to a planning piece. And, you know, I always chuckle when I see the cohabitate option up here. That usually is not something that is much of an exciting concept for either the children or for the seniors looking to make their next move. Today, we'll talk about the life plan community. It's the ability for you to plan, make a change now while you have the ability to do that and really have your choices be out at the forefront. If you've seen one of the 1,930 CCRCs, you've seen one of them. They all have little nuances within their contracts and their offerings and amenities. But just as you start to boil it down, if you look at contract types, there are primarily three in the not-for-profit world: an A, a B, and a C. A type A contract is essentially the highest insurance component, meaning what you pay in independent living is essentially what you will be paying if you need a higher level of care, such as assisted living, memory support, or nursing care. So you have predictability. Yes, there will be inflation adjustments on at least an annual basis, typically for monthly service fees, but you have an understanding of what those costs will be because they're what you would be paying in independent living. I'm going to skip the type C first instead of go and come back to B. A type C is at the other end of the spectrum. It's really what I like to call a back-end loaded contract. You probably pay the least amount of an entrance fee and probably the lowest amount of the different contract types for a monthly service fee while you're in independent living. But the moment you need a higher level of care, you will move to market rate. And this is really that type of contract for the individuals who think they'll never need a higher level of care. So why not choose a type C contract? In the middle of the type B, it's a hybrid or a modified contract. It's kind of the best of both worlds. It's a little less of an insurance contract than the type A contract. But if you do need a higher level of care at a later time, you will step up to a higher rate in assisted living or memory support or nursing, but you won't go to market rate. So you have similar amenities, you're paying less while you're in the lower level of care, but you still have an insurance component moving into a higher level of care later in life. Some people will say, well, Medicare will take care of me, or I have long-term care insurance that will take care of me. I don't really have to worry about this. A quick couple of bullets on Medicare. It is pretty restrictive. And for the majority of our residents that we see across all of our communities, Medicare really doesn't cover most of the expenditures. Typically, you have to have a 3-night hospital stay, overnight, no less. And then it's up to a 100-day limit there, and that weans its way down over time as well. It's not even 100% for the whole 100 days. Long-term care insurance, absolutely can help you, especially with a type B or type C contract. Because if you do move to a higher level of care, you have the ability to utilize that long-term care insurance care policy to reimburse yourself for the community's expenditures while you're in any level above independent living. But the problem with long-term care insurance is you may not be at a position where you can actually choose where you're going to receive that care. So by choosing in long-term care, choosing a CCRC now, you have the ability to pick your change in what you want while you're still an independent living individual. A couple slides just of criteria to think about as you go through your evaluation process. Some of it is pretty basic, but it's important nonetheless. How easy is it for you to get audited financial statements from the community? It's nice if they're posted online. And what I would say is when you go through the audited financials, don't just pay attention to the numbers in the front, really read the footnotes, because sound organizations, transparent organizations will disclose much more than they're required to in the footnotes. And that's actually where you can read words as opposed to just look at numbers. Additionally, you want to make sure the organization is conducting actuarial audits and actuarial studies. These are done just what it says by an actuary, a wealth of information for the community to work through to make long-term decisions. Remember, at the end of the day, this is really an insurance component. It's a risk component. So using actuarial numbers to make business decisions is really sound. Most communities will not share the full report with you because it is something that you would look at before you went to bed at night, and it would put you right to sleep. But to listen and moving to the next bullet there is ask the financial executive about what's in the study and how they utilize that. Listen to the financial executive. He or she are not giving you a sales pitch. They're probably talking more as an accountant or a financial person of running the business, and see if they can explain it to you in a common person perspective. Listen to their financial philosophy. Does it make sense to you? Does it seem reasonable? If it seems complex, then you may want to push back further to really understand it, because our business is quirky, but it's not overly complex at the end of the day. If you get to the point where you're actually visiting the communities, which I highly recommend, look at the buildings and grounds. That's a first impression, is a lasting impression. Is the community reinvesting in its programming and its infrastructure? Because having crisp contemporary campuses is incredibly important to driving occupancy, as Keith has already alluded to, and I'll spend a little more time on in a couple slides. But it's really important not only for the existing residents, but for the future residents. And know that, Keith showed the baby boomer chart coming, and all those individuals who are turning 65 plus. Over time, the market does change. You want to make sure the organization is keeping up with that. Leading Age is a national association. There's a conference actually coming up this coming week. Is the community a member of that? We share information there. Resident involvement. So does the community you might be looking at have a resident council and or a resident finance committee? And what I would say here is, and we say this to our residents in each of the communities, we really value your voice, but at the end of the day, your vote isn't, you don't have a vote. It's the board of trustees that ultimately have to make those decisions. But our board of trustees makes sure that it has the resident input as it's weighing through those pieces. That perspective is incredibly important. And what you won't find in a for-profit, you most likely will find in a not-for-profit, but you should ask about it, is a benevolence clause. So after an organization accepts you into the community, if you outlive your assets, do you have a place to stay for the rest of your lives? And communities with a benevolence clause will spell that out, that as long as you haven't personally impoverished yourself, you can stay with the community even if you've outlived your assets. That's incredibly important for peace of mind. Some things to look for, and I've chosen just to focus on mature communities here. I think new startups will probably have very similar issues, as well as just being a startup and construction cost and occupancy challenges and rising interest rates. But for existing communities, it is all about occupancy. So pay attention to what their occupancy levels are, and are they able to absorb significant turnover? Do they have too much debt in their balance sheet? And conversely, is there not enough debt? Because there are some communities that have chosen not to reinvest in their infrastructure and instead pay down their debt. Not necessarily a great move, because the campus can become dated and therefore impact occupancy. Look for competition. And this is really important here. It's not just not-for-profit competition, it's also for-profit competition. And the for-profit entities are getting better and better of mirroring the look of a not-for-profit. So you really have to dig into the details and the fine matter to understand what the competition is out in the marketplace. We've talked at length about the look of the organization, and also the ability. A strong organization will have its ability to access capital, and access capital at advantageous rates. So the lower the borrowing cost, the better for our residents, because if I can pay our bondholders less, that doesn't directly the cash going out to the bondholders doesn't directly impact the services and what our residents see. So the more cash I have available to do that, the better the resident satisfaction, the better the overall success of the community. And really, the strong entities out there, they're going to grow at a reasonable rate. We call it here at Riverwoods bite-sized growth. Satisfy as much of the wait list as you can, keep out competition, but don't overextend yourself. The last thing you want is to have a brand new community that doesn't fill up in a reasonable period of time. That's a recipe for disaster. Again, access to capital, strong balance sheets to weather the storm. I can't stress that enough. In the last couple of years, especially, the organizations that had strong balance sheets had the ability to deal with the pandemic, not raise rates at a crazy amount, and really weather the storm and come out of it stronger than ever. And Riverwoods is an example of that. And Keith has talked about consolidation as well. And the only additional point I'd make there is it's not necessarily just affiliation or partnering up with other organizations. It's also strategic partnerships where you may share purchasing power across multiple entities. So it doesn't have to be a full legal joining. It can also be leveraging your strengths and your best practices across competitors that may not be in your market space. Just a publication that's available from our team here. We put this together because there was not a lot of education in the marketplace. This is not a Riverwoods commercial. It actually can be applicable to anybody looking to choosing a continuing care retirement community, and it's available to you at free of charge. Why we think we're a little different here. We are a grassroots. We're two founders sitting around a dinner table in the 1980s. We're not affiliated with a university, with a fraternity organization, with a church. We are totally grassroots. We run our business with three mantras. We want to protect the core. So the stabilized communities we have, we always want to protect them. We want to maximize our resources. How do we leverage building and purchasing power across the system? But at the same time, we never want to lose sight that the economics are out there, and we do need to plan for the future. We do need to look at reasonable growth, and then it's back to protect the future, protect the core, and maximize the resources. It's something that never goes away. We have a nice balance of tenure on both our management team and our board here at Riverwoods. So our CEO has been with us a couple months before the first community opened in 1994. I will celebrate my 17th anniversary next week. But we also have other individuals who have joined us in the last couple of years that strike a nice balance and bring a fresh perspective for us. So we look at that. We also have tenure limits for our board, term limits, and we have a very purposeful recruitment of board members as others term off, so that there's always a continuity there. Keith mentioned earlier, one of our entities, Riverwoods Exeter, is not only COF accredited, but also has an A- Fitch rating. We get asked the question a lot, well, what about Manchester and Durham? Will you pursue accreditation and a bond rating for them? At this time, not really, because everything we learn with one of the entities in the system going through the process, we're able to leverage across the system. And with our debt structure, we're actually able to leverage our lending relationship so that we can get investment grade pricing, even without having the formal investment grade and for the cost of our debt. And that is part of the family of communities. Our bankers, our lenders know that how we manage Riverwoods Exeter is how we're going to manage the other organizations within the system. Again, real ease of, this is happens to be our group website, but our audited reports and our annual reports are available out there. And then lastly, just as you dig down even further, probably this is going to be the 5,000-foot view now, but I'm going to show some slides to help you think through this, but some ideas as you narrow down your choices and you really want to look at the financial viability of a group of communities that you're considering. It's occupancy, it's key ratios. As the organization, as you're looking at it, how do they benchmark? What are they pulling out? Are they looking at accredited organizations, rated organizations? Are they comparing to how they've done in the past? Are they projecting out into the future? Look at all of those things and look at the trends, because trends are incredibly important. So I'm going to start with occupancy. We say occupancy, occupancy, occupancy. And it's really at all levels of care. So in the independent living units, which you'll typically see are the vast majority of the makeup of CCRC's total units, the industry considers 95% independent living occupancy full, because there are always some units that are in some stage of refurbishment. Look and see where the organization has been. A drop in occupancy isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's possible that the organization is adding units. It's possible that it's reconfiguring existing units, but understand where the trend is going as you come out of that. Another important thing to do is to look at the organization's wait list, understand what it takes to get on the wait list. If it's writing a $100 check to be on the wait list, that's a little different than leaving a 10% deposit of the future entrance fee. But a wait list in the manufacturing world, I consider is the backlog. So as units open, do you have a ready availability of new residents or in future new residents that are ready to come in? And the healthcare side, again, look at the trends, and then ask how the community manages census, because this is an interesting one. You want to make sure as a life care resident that there are healthcare units available for you if and when you should need them in the future. So running at 100% is not necessarily a good thing in the health center, but also you want to make sure we're not leaving money on the table if the community is not doing a good job of managing the census and is really leaving a significant buffer of unused healthcare beds. That's not a good sign either, because typically you're already staffed to have those beds full. So you've got to look at that balance. Typically, I would like our communities to run a health center occupancy of around 90%, which leaves a 10% buffer for those what ifs. This happens to be one of the benefits of being an accredited organization. You get another a sleeper book, if you will, but financial ratios and trends analysis. It's a wealth of information for us to go through and look at various benchmarks. And then just a couple slides. We're going to go through this real quick and bring Bill in. Cash to debt ratio. This happens to be a capital structure ratio that you would find how to calculate in that book. 10 years of data for Riverwoods Exeter here, and you can see a significant ramp up over time. And then as I'm looking at this, there's a drop in the last fiscal year. And there's two stories to that. One, the organization has the ability, if it wanted to pay off all of its debt and still have 50% of its cash available to stay on the balance sheet. That's an incredible show of strength. But the drop off from 21 to 22 is really a correction in the marketplace as well. Investment markets finally had a correction, if you will, and that's represented in that year-end number. It's still very strong. If we go to our Manchester community, this is capital structure again, but a different ratio. It's average age of facility. It's an accountant's way of determining the age of a campus using numbers. And on this particular ratio, lower is better. Everybody wants to be younger. And in 10 years, with the significant reinvestment at Riverwoods Manchester, we've actually been able to reduce its age by 100%, and it's less than an 8-year-old campus, even though it was originally built in 1990. And then lastly, our Riverwoods Durham campus. Sorry, I can't show you 10 years of data because it's really only been open for 2 full fiscal years. We're coming on our 30th anniversary in November of the grand opening of the campus. But very strong. This is a liquidity measure for the organization, days cash on hand. And somebody may look at this and say, well, from 21 to 22, there's a drop off. And you're right. Again, investment markets did have a correction. But what I would say when I talk to somebody about this measure is this campus, if it didn't take a dime more of revenue in, would be able to survive without making any operational changes for almost 2 full years. So not that we would ever expect that to happen, but that's an incredibly strong measure for a campus that has been open just over 2 years. And then some other practices here, and you can read most of these. I'm going to skip right ahead to the residents on the Board of Trustees. So our organization actually has 5 full voting members that are on the Board of Trustees who are also residents. That's really important because you get that your perspective. When the resident is on the board, when they are voting as a board member, they are voting as a board member, though. They have their fiduciary responsibility. And these members are well respected and bring an incredible perspective to our board. And I say that because bringing on Bill Stafford here, he is a resident of our Ridge campus at Riverwoods Exeter. As noted earlier, he's been at the campus for over 6 years with his wife, and he actually is also a resident trustee. He serves on the CCRC board here in Exeter. So with that, I'll kick it over to Bill.
Thanks, Kevin. I guess that also means I have a certain amount of vested interest in how Exeter performs, right? The whole Riverwoods group. Well, of course I do. You've gotten a really strong background from several different levels and perspectives from Keith and Kevin. I'm not going to use any numbers, and I'm not going to use any charts. I'm just going to tell a couple of stories because I think in some ways that's how we as residents and prospective residents come to know a community. Not unlike when our kids were getting ready to go to college, and a good part of their process was going on campus and seeing how it felt. When my wife and I were thinking about what's next, we actually started the process of looking for a place to live about 5 years before we came to Exeter. And Exeter wasn't on the drawing board at that point. We weren't even sure about the part of the country. So we did a good deal of thinking about it. We visited some parts of the country that we enjoy and had some connection to, and began to hone in on New England for a number of reasons, not least of which was the existence of family in this area. And that was That was a big commitment because we lived in the Midwest at the time. About the time all that was going on, my wife's aunt, who at the time was in her late 80s, lost her husband and came to the conclusion that she needed to be in a less rural, better kind of a place for herself in terms of care, and ended up choosing a CCRC south of Asheville, North Carolina, called Deerfield. Deerfield's about the same size as the Riverwoods Exeter CCRC within the Riverwoods group. We followed her progress as she went into that community, and one of the things that we learned in that process was that as a late 80-year-old going into that community, although there were certainly plenty of folks her age, it was kind of tough for her to get to know people, because by that time, folks who had come in their mid to late 70s or early 80s had already formed community with others, and people form groups, and it was a little tough to break in. And this aunt is a person who was very vivacious and not shy at all when you come right down to it. And so that was an interesting and important perspective for my wife and I to understand with respect to how quickly we might want to seriously consider a CCRC. We ultimately decided that sooner was better, and got onto the wait list at Exeter after looking at a number of different places, sort of up and down the eastern seaboard, and based on experiences we'd had with other communities and other relatives who had been part of communities, and being mindful of financial strength and so on. And then another story. We went on a road trip, as we are wont to do, and visited that aunt at her community in near Asheville. We stayed in the community. She was kind enough to host us for a couple of nights. And by the way, most communities have places that you can stay, and that's really a great thing because you get a good sense for what's going on. And while we were there, I asked if there was time for the director of marketing in that community to talk with me. I wanted to know a little bit about what they were thinking about the future and what was available in their community. Although we were on the wait list at Exeter, we certainly still had our eyes open. And she was kind enough to make some time. So I went down to visit with her at 9 a.m. one morning. And we talked for a bit, and she told me about cottages they were planning to build and so on. And then she said, "So what are you thinking about? What are you looking at?" And I told her, and I mentioned that we were on the wait list for Riverwoods Exeter. And she said, "Oh, Riverwoods, that's the place where I started my career. That's my model for how you do this business." Wow. I guess I wasn't going to switch wait lists at that point. Thanks for being interested. Riverwoods is a great place. Jen,
Thank you
it's all
so
yours.
much. Thank you so much, Bill and Keith and Kevin. We really, really appreciate your time and level of expertise. And I know we have had numerous questions, some of which have been answered at this point. But let me just get to some of these questions here that remain. Are all your communities on the new 70-30 reimbursement model? No, they are not. Manchester is 70% refundable, Exeter is 90% refundable, and Durham is 90% refundable for singles and 80% refundable for couples, 3 different contract types. I've read that CCRC contracts are akin to Ponzi schemes. How valid is that? Who would like to take that question?
I'll take that one. Or Keith, do you want to take that one?
Do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've answered this before, and so in the sense that a refund is paid from a resale of a future unit, I guess you could maybe compare it to a Ponzi scheme, but it's really that future revenue coming in that makes that refund. Where it's different from a Ponzi scheme is if the organization, like a Riverwoods, continuously reinvests in their building, they remain financially strong, then they remain attractive to future residents. So even though you do need that future resident to move in to make the refund, it's those well-run organizations that continuously provide value to their current and future residents. So that it goes back to what Kevin was talking about. When you look to move in, look for the organizations that have reinvested properly, that have strong credit ratings, that have strong financial performance, because those are the ones who have learned how to remain viable and attractive, not just to current residents, but to future residents and future generations.
Yeah, and I would just add to that especially for specifically in not-for-profits, there are no external stakeholders. Any margin or any reinvestment, it benefits the community. It always is going back into the community. It doesn't go to any. It doesn't get paid out to the top investor. It's always back into the community for the mission.
Thank you so much. Before we go to the next question, just wanted you to know that Kim has posted a link to the Solo and Smart webinar in the chat box. You can click on the link and register. And of course, you can scan the code here on this page and look at the Riverwoods Group website to sign up as well. Next question, could the Riverwoods organization be taken over by another organization? If so, what would that mean for the residents?
Keith, you want to? I mean, it could. I mean, that's really for any organization, right?
Yeah, and I think any organization has the strategic ability to decide to join up with another organization. But knowing Riverwoods and frankly other not-for-profit organizations, scale is important to be able to stay in existence in perpetuity, which is any mission of a not-for-profit. So could Riverwoods be taken over? I suppose the real answer is yes. But Riverwoods, even going back to its very beginning, and maybe its first expansion, which was done back in 2004, recognized that it was so important to have scale. And since the initial campus, and then the Ridge campus, the Boulders campus, the affiliation with Birch Hill, Riverwoods Manchester, and then growing by the new campus of Riverwoods Durham. Riverwoods as an organization is doing everything that any not-for-profit could or should do to be able to be in existence in perpetuity. So Kevin, you can add on to that.
Yeah, and what I would add to that as well, I mean, you can see Keith and I, we love to add on to each other. We've been at this for a long time, with complementary perspectives, obviously, but you know, the word takeover certainly has it has a for-profit feel to it. So I would actually use a different term, and that is, would the Riverwoods Group agree to an affiliation at some point in the future? And the difference there is it would be the board believing that would be the best decision for the organization to further the mission. I mean, given the strength of the organization, it wouldn't necessarily need to reach out and say we need help from a larger system. It would actually reach out or have other communities reach out to it to say, is there a better way to do this as a larger entity? And typically, I think the second part of that question was, how would the residents be impacted? Typically, they're not impacted at all because they have their specific contracts that are already in place and that already have laid out what the amenities are and what the legal agreements are.
Next question. Keith mentioned that the source of income for not-for-profit is monthly service fee. What about entrance fees and interests thus collected in investments?
It's a lot of organizations do have a fairly large, whether it's an endowment or unrestricted cash, which often is made up of net entrance fee receipts. And it does earn interest and or capital gains. So that is certainly a part of the income that a CCRC generates, but I would say a majority of the revenue that a not-for-profit CCRC generates is from monthly service fees.
Yeah, and just in a nutshell, for our philosophy within our community is we really look at our expectation, depending on the community, of course, but in general, the monthly service fee cash that is coming in is available to pay all of our cash operating expenditures in a normal year, probably leave a little buffer. From the entrance fee standpoint, the cash coming in from entrance fees, that isn't ours to keep forever. It's typically 70 or 90% refundable. That cash coming in is available to pay those refundable entrance fees that are contractually owed, as well as debt principal and capital reinvestment. A third prong is that investment income, but we can't predict the markets, so we really can't plan on that in any short order. That is really to generate a buffers and reserves for those black swan events that may come up in the marketplace.
Please explain the transition of not-for-profit CCRCs to for-profit. I think 40, oops, I lost it. Let's see, where did it- I think 46% was cited early in the presentation today. Please describe impact on affected residents. Please describe likelihood of Riverwoods moving to for-profit status.
I think, Kevin, I'll start this again, and I'll start with the last part of that question. I think the chances of Riverwoods moving to a for-profit entity, I would say, are as close to zero as any bet you'll ever make. But as I mentioned, 46% of the transitions that have occurred over the past 10 years of not-for-profits, or frankly, any not-for-profit transitioning, 46% of those have moved over to the skilled or to the for-profit side. That's not just CCRCs, that's any form of not-for-profit senior housing and or care. So a lot of that 46% have been standalone skilled nursing facilities, which the for-profit sector tends to do, I would say maybe better than from a financial perspective, better than the not-for-profit side. Generally, they have lower staffing ratios and provide, I would say, a lower quality of care. Therefore, they can be a bit more profitable. So a majority of that 46% are the standalone skilled nursing facilities. But I think more importantly, if it is a CCRC, there have been a handful of CCRCs that have primarily been forced to sell, and the typical acquirer of those facilities has been the for-profit sector. They have different access to capital, and can move, frankly, a lot quicker than the not-for-profit sector can. So what happens to resident contracts, and Ziegler has tracked this probably since the mid-'80s, and generally resident contracts are maintained. There's been one situation, maybe two, over the past 20 or 30 years where a sale was forced because of poor performance, generally forced on by the lenders, and resident contracts were slightly adjusted. Residents didn't lose all of their refunds, but maybe a portion of it. But that was actually back in, I believe that the last time that happened was maybe 2006 or 2007. So since then, the lenders generally recognize that the real value of any CCRC are the residents. So they understand that even though the residents are unsecured creditors and they are probably secured by a mortgage, the bondholders recognize that the residents need to be protected, not just for that current investment, but for I would say the investment across the sector. Because if there's if there's any situation where residents get hurt, primarily their refunds or they lose their homes, that would be a challenge that the sector would have a hard time overcoming. So everybody around the table understands that residents come first, and they are protected, usually by judges as well, bankruptcy judges if it goes through bankruptcy. So that's how things generally work out. and maybe even more than generally. That is how it works out.
I have nothing to add to that one, Jen.
Okay. Can a long-term care policy be applied to a type A CCRC? It can, and maybe you can talk to that, Kevin, the differences between the two.
Yeah, so it absolutely can be applied to it, but normally what and the way it would work is essentially you still have your obligation to the community for your monthly service fees, but if you are in the health center, assisted living, level of care or above, you have the ability to take your CCRC monthly bill and make a claim to your long-term care insurance carrier for reimbursement. They'll reimburse you directly. We don't have any mutual agreements. So it's really a twofold approach, but we'll help you with that claim. Why some people don't continue to maintain their long-term care policy if they come to a type A community is they already know that what they're paying in independent living is what they're going to be paying essentially in the health center. So they've taken out the spike in cost, and some choose to give up the long-term care policy. Others have chosen to keep it even in a type A community, because if the long-term care policy has a home health rider in it, you have the ability to stay in your independent apartment longer and utilize your long-term care insurance policy to pay for those services. You can actually bring services into your independent apartment. So it does have value. It's not as much of a value for a type B or a type C community though.
Then a type B with the discount off market rate, sometimes the policies may go farther.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
That's correct too. Thank you.
Does the acquisition of Manchester mean that Manchester has the financial strength and backing of the Riverwoods Group, or are they a separate entity that might be weaker and allowed to fail despite the strength of the group?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in forming the system, the reason for forming the Riverwoods Group in the first place was to isolate or put a firewall and protect the core, protect the existing communities for anything that may come up in the future with respect to growth. Because as you're taking on a new product line or you're building a new community, there's risk associated with that. So the growth was anticipated to actually come through the Riverwoods Group. There's no commingling of assets at any of the individual communities. So Manchester, to answer the specific question, it has its own debt issuance. It has its own cash and investments on the balance sheet. Those are not commingled with Exeter's or Durham's or vice versa. The group has provided some loans to Riverwoods Manchester to help it get over the hump, but those are agreements that are between the Riverwoods Group and Riverwoods Manchester. It's not amongst the sister communities. And Manchester is doing quite well. I mean, that average age of chart, I could have showed you some occupancy charts. Manchester hit 91% occupancy on the independent side for the first time in its history on June 30th. And it's in the low 90s right now and is continuing to reap the benefits of that reinvestment in its campus and the programming. And the organization, each organization does have the opportunity to undertake future growth on its own, but it would be with support from the Riverwoods Group and really the overall strength of the knowledge base across all of the communities. But they are financially isolated and protected.
And truly, because of our $22 million renovation recently, we couldn't be in the 90s because apartments were taken offline and being gutted and totally renovated. So are there calculators to help us see the financial impact of different type A and type B CCRCs? It seems difficult to compare one to another.
Keith, I don't know what there is. So from our financial qualification perspective at Riverwoods, we utilize an actuarial software program that is proprietary. It is not shared with prospective residents. We're happy to share the printout of where it ends up from our reading of it. But I don't know, Keith, if there are individual calculators out in the industry that will look at that.
Not that I've heard of. I do know some financial advisors will try to figure out if you're looking at a type A or a type B community. But ultimately, it's very much driven by, as Kevin mentioned, the actuarial part of the business. Because if you don't move through the healthcare facilities, then the costs are different. So it really is guesswork, and that's why I don't think anybody has a real good calculator prepared.
And I think in the years that I've been doing this, typically the choice isn't financially based for the residents coming in. It's really what are they more comfortable with. It's really what it's almost like a risk tolerance. Am I comfortable? Do I really want to insure against all of my future healthcare exposure, even though I know I might never need to go to assisted living, or do I want to just take that chance? And if I get to needing assisted living, then I know I'm going to go to market rate. It's really it's a personal preference, not necessarily just a money order. And maybe Bill, did you entertain that discussion at all as you were thinking about communities?
Absolutely. And I would say that the decision was not so much financial as it was thinking about how our aging process could impact the lives of our kids. And I've heard that from lots of fellow residents here. We've essentially taken the burden of making sure that we were well cared for off of the table with respect to what our kids have to worry about as their careers develop and as they raise their families.
Next question is a purchase contract made with the Riverwoods Group, or is it campus specific? The contracts are campus specific and they are not a purchase, they're an insurance contract. So can you transfer to another campus if you wish when spots are available? I've never seen that happen in 6 years I've been with Riverwoods. Kevin?
It's very rare. And again, each of these campuses are separate legal entities. If the opportunity did come up where somebody had a preference to be in a different town or a situation arose where home situation or family situation has changed, we would sit down with that individual and have a discussion, but it wouldn't be just it's not a swap because they are completely different legal entities, and we have to treat them as such.
We've transferred deposits before signing a contract a couple of times. So, right.
Yeah, and it would be a brand new contract that would have to be signed with the receiving community.
Right.
But they work. We work well together, so we would try to find something that worked for all parties.
Does Riverwoods Group have plans for further expansion in New Hampshire? Are there any plans for Riverwoods in the Portsmouth, New Hampshire area?
That must be somebody from the Portsmouth area. I mean, as Jen showed in the early part of the presentation, SPE, STE, someplace else, something else. We are always thinking about that. Even during the pandemic, our Riverwoods Group board was saying, we know you really have to focus on operations, but don't lose sight of the future as well. It's really important. There are no distinct plans right now, in all honesty. We are coming out of the pandemic and we want to make sure our existing 3 campuses, communities are thriving. It's really important to have a solid base and make sure that everything is well taken care of there. That being said, Manchester is in the process of looking at an 18-unit cottage expansion project right now that is being very well received. Riverwoods Exeter, we have been talking about consolidating the healthcare units there, because right now we have 3 separate healthcare units in each of the buildings. Very expensive. Keith talked earlier about the staffing challenges. That is not the most opportune model for cost efficiency, which translates into monthly service fee increases. In Durham, we have some land across the street that we bought during the building of that community. So we're thinking through different things. Nothing concrete at this point on that, and it's a process. I mean, we move at the speed of a not-for-profit. You see the Keith slide. For-profits move really fast. Money burns a hole in their pocket, but they have out strategies. We have to be here forever. We make long-term commitments, so we have to be really methodical and thoughtful in what we look for as we look to expand the mission. Specific to Portsmouth, nothing at this point.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is a good question. Why does Riverwoods Exeter always stress the 90% contract when it also has a fully amortized contract that makes more sense for some folks?
Yeah, I'll take that one as well. That is the predominant contract that has typically been selected over the years by our residents. It was the contract style that our founders were very fond of, and that was really important to them. They saw it as asset preservation, being able to leave something to their estate or their heirs at the end of life. So we try to honor that. I think it's also very prevalent in the Northeast as well for a 90% refundable. It's kind of that Yankee concept up here. We do in Exeter, we do have a 50% refundable contract and a declining balance contract, and we will have those discussions with prospective residents as well and entertain those. It's not that we don't want to sell those, but typically we have seen that the 90% is the most popular and the most sought after.
Thank you. I was told about a CCRC independent living resident, not Riverwoods, who, when they needed a higher level of care, were told that there was no available on-site assisted living space. Could this happen at Riverwoods? And if so, what would be the residents' options other than seeking a refund or termination?
So it could happen. It goes back earlier when I talked about how communities manage that census in the health center, leaving enough availability for life care residents if they are moving to a higher level of care, but also not having it so empty that it's not generating any revenue and everybody's paying to staff it with nobody in there. In the history of Riverwoods, we'd have to go way back, probably over 20 years ago. We were just one campus, the Woods campus, that was opened in 1994. It was full in independent living, and the health center was filling up. It got to the point where we had a few residents who actually needed that high level of care, and we could not deliver that. We didn't have any space. We were 100% in the health center. We have mutual agreements, memorandums of understanding with other communities in the immediate area, where if there is not space available here, we would look to them and vice versa. So that's what the contract says at the end of the day. Our intent is to provide that care on campus. If we aren't able to do it, here's how it would play out. But what we would do is then as soon as we could find space, we would bring that individual back. Those were tough decisions, and they were really not, we looked at every available option, including providing additional services in the independent apartment for a period of time. What we learned from that is there's strength in volume, and we knew the Woods wasn't large enough to sustain that. So we are actually in the process of developing the second campus here in Exeter, the Ridge. And from that point on, we have never had this opportunity or we have never had this situation come up since the early 1990s. And we are very careful. If there's anything, we will err on the side of conservatism on leaving a couple of extra units open, as opposed to having to have the services provided outside of the community for a period of time.
And the care coordination teams, the transfer teams meet weekly and are just so in tune with who has a need, and they manage their censuses beautifully. It hasn't happened here for a very long time, maybe once in many years. if we have time for more questions, we have a few more here. Have benchmarks for accepting residents' financials changed because of the market?
I'll take that one as well. You know, we look at our financial acceptance criteria, we build it so that it's sustainable for over long periods of time, and we have not changed it with the pandemic. We actually didn't make significant changes during the Great Recession. If anything, we are gonna err on the side of conservatism, and we'd rather be surprised on the upside. But we do continue to watch that closely. You know, the investment markets changing, they may change in some short periods of time, but over long periods of time, our assumptions are pretty valid. And we feel comfortable with that, but it's something that we are always testing and retesting.
One more, what is actually deductible, and is that only if you itemize on your taxes? Most of us, if we sell our home, no longer itemize. Do you want to talk to that, Kevin?
Yeah, I'll talk to that. And I'm going to say lead off with it depends, because every year it can be a little different, whether the tax law changes or the performance of the community changes. But in general, the year you move in, the non-refundable portion of your entrance fee is typically deductible in that calendar year as a prepaid medical tax deduction. Your individual situation will ultimately determine that, but in general, if you have a 90% refundable on a $300,000 entrance fee, that means 10% is non-refundable, or $30,000. That would be a deductible as a medical tax expense in year one. And then ongoing, while you are in independent living, typically somewhere between 25% and 35% of your monthly service fee as an independent living resident will be deductible as a prepaid medical expense. We have that calculated every year by an outside consultant. I had somebody ask me the other day, well, can you toggle it to make it a bigger deduction? You really can't do that. But if you are in the health center, so assisted living or a higher level of care, 100% of your monthly service fee is then deductible as a medical tax deduction.
And if you have more questions about that, talk to your sales counselor.
Yes.
Yeah. Super. So I think we've gone above and beyond the 1 hour limit by about 25 minutes, if it's okay. I would say let's call it quits here. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Kevin, Keith, and Bill. You've been terrific, a huge help to everyone. We can follow up with these questions and certainly, again, reach out to your sales counselor if we can help further. So thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good luck, everyone.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.